In need of a good read or just want to keep up with the books everyone's talking about? NPR's Book of the Day podcast gives you today's very best writing in a pocket-sized show. Whether you're looking to engage with the big questions of our times or temporarily escape from them, we've got an author who'll speak to you. Catch today's great books in 15 minutes or less on the Book of the Day podcast, only from NPR.
Hey, it's Tali, here to tell you about the podcast Israel Story. Now, more than ever, Israel is a tough topic. Some love it, others hate it, but Israel Story offers a nuanced, faithful window into the extraordinary stories of everyday people in Israel. Beautiful and ugly, tragic and inspiring, ridiculous and heartwarming. Check out hundreds of timeless episodes in their back catalog or dive into the 65 Wartime Diaries episodes capturing slivers of life right now. Hear voices from soldiers to survivors, farmers to rabbis, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and connect with this complicated, amazing place. Hosted by Mishi Harman and produced with the Jerusalem Foundation and the Times of Israel, find Israel Story wherever you get your podcasts. Welcome to The 5 Books, where each week we talk with a Jewish author about 5 books that are near and dear to them. My name is Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Every week, I ask Jewish authors about 5 books in 5 categories. We'll hear about 2 Jewish books that have impacted the author's Jewish identity. We'll hear about 1 book, not necessarily Jewish, that they think everyone should read, a book that changed their worldview. We'll get a peek into what the author is reading now, and we'll get to hear about the new book they've just published and how it came about. Today, we'll be talking with Francine Klagsbrun about her nuanced and compelling biography, Henrietta Szold, Hadassah and the Zionist Dream. Szold is best known for the creation of Hadassah, the women's Zionist organization, which she founded in 1912. She later moved to Mandate Palestine to help shape education, health, and social services there. But the pinnacle of her career came when she was already in her 70s, when she took on the task of directing the Youth Aliyah program during the rise of Nazi Germany. In her work with the Youth Aliyah, she helped rescue thousands of young people from the Nazis and resettled them in Palestine. In her work, Szold aimed to improve the lives of both Jews and Arabs.
She felt that the Jews and Arabs could live together peacefully, that, this is a land that belonged to both of them. She cared very much about the Arab population.
Our interview today is with the author, Francine Klagsbrun. Born in 1931, Francine herself has had a tremendous impact on the story of American Jewish women. She's the author of more than a dozen books, including Lioness, Golda Meir and the Nation of Israel, which won the National Jewish Book Award in 2017. In 1978, she was one of 3 women and 11 men appointed by the Chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America to a special commission to study the issue of ordaining women as rabbis, and she became known for her activism in this arena. Fun fact, Francine was the first woman to carry a Torah at the Western Wall. She has been a columnist for New York Jewish Week and Moment, is a contributing editor to Lilith, and is on the editorial board of Hadassah Magazine. Her writings have appeared in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Newsweek, Ms. Magazine, and other national publications. Francine will tell us about the Jewish education she was given as a child.
I have an older brother. There was no question they would send him to the yeshiva for boys. And my mother, to her credit, said, whatever he gets, whatever education he gets, she gets.
She'll share the story that sparked her feminist activism.
I went to one of the big shop men, and I said, I'm getting paid less than the other senior editors. Maybe I could become senior editor.
And we'll understand why Henrietta Szold's legacy should be reconsidered now.
Part of those times was this was sort of the poor old maid and the handsome young man. Well, that's changed. We don't think of her as a poor old maid anymore. We think of her as one terrific woman.
Francine graciously hosted me in her New York City apartment, complete with a table full of snacks. If you hear a siren or a horn in the background, I hope you'll feel like you were sitting there alongside us. Hi, Francine.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining me here on The 5 Books.
It's my pleasure.
And hosting me here in your beautiful apartment.
Thank you.
You recently published Henrietta Szold, Hadassah and the Zionist Dream. It's part of the Yale University Press Jewish Live series, and it was also selected as a Natan Notable Book. So for listeners who may not be familiar with Henrietta, can you give us the highlights of her accomplishments?
Well, she's best known as the founder of Hadassah, but she did, before that and after that, she did other things. Before that, as a young woman, she started a night school for immigrants coming from Eastern Europe that became the model of night schools and of schools where they helped immigrants assimilate to the United States. So that was what she did as a young woman out of high school. And then she was the editor, the first editor, but they called her secretary, which I always get angry about, but the first editor of the Jewish Publication Society. Then she studied at the Jewish Theological Seminary and had a very painful love for one of the professors, Louis Ginsburg. That didn't work out. He rejected her. She went to Palestine, what was then Palestine, under Ottoman control, and saw poverty there, saw hospitals that were very badly run, but also saw settlers there. Very taken with that. Came back, but didn't get over this terrible love and rejection by this professor. And she went into a Great Depression that lasted several months. And then, with strong will and resilience, she pulled herself out of that depression and decided it was time to start a national Jewish Women's Zionist organization. And that's when she started Hadassah. And under her leadership, Hadassah grew very quickly from just a few chapters to many chapters to becoming the most powerful and important Zionist women's Zionist organization, well, any Zionist organization in America, but really one of the most important women's organizations, Jewish or not, in the United States. They took as their mission creating health care for the people in the land of Israel. And then under the World Zionist Organization, she became the head of their education department and revolutionized education in the land of Israel. And it became a really good system that she was in charge of. In what was called the Va'ad Le'umi, the National Council, she was in charge of all their social work department. She started a social work department. She started a social work school. She had earlier started a nursing school. And she, again, revolutionized how social work was done in Israel. It was now beautifully organized under her supervision. And from there, at the age of 70, she took on what she considered her most important position, which was she headed what was called Youth Aliyah. It was the beginning of the 30s. World War II was about to break out. Nazism was already spreading throughout Europe. And under her guidance, young people, boys and girls, were rescued at first from Germany and resettled in the land in Palestine, the land of Israel, the Holy Land. And in the end, her organization rescued thousands of young people during the Holocaust. And that she considered her greatest accomplishment. And then she died in 1945 before the State of Israel was established.
She had such an incredible life, and it seemed like everything that she touched was like magically. She organized it. She made it efficient. She made it happen. She brought these ideas to fruition. You spend so much time researching her. What were the things that you felt like you most appreciated about her?
Well, you sort of just touched on it. She was just this super organizer. I mean, I don't know anyone who could come in and organize so well. She began, one of the things she had done before she started Hadassah was organize the papers of the Federation of American Zionists, the male Zionist organization. She said it was like cleaning out the Aegean stables. They were so messy. She organized them. She just had this brilliant touch for organization. So I consider that her greatest asset in that sense. She was also very modest about her accomplishments. She knew that what she did was important. She knew that her way was the right way, and she insisted on her way. But she always had insecurities and was modest about her accomplishments and always sort of pushed them off to other people. If she got complimented, well, it was somebody else who did it. And that was a very nice trait about somebody who was so accomplished. So she was a woman who had great will, great knowledge, modesty about the knowledge and yet the ability to get things done. And that's not, you can't say that about many people.
Yeah, as a native Baltimorean myself, her name was a name that I knew, but it felt like she was somebody that I should have grown up learning about in school and knowing so much more about. I was so grateful for the opportunity to get to know her.
Thank you.
Yeah.
She was very famous in her own day. And President Roosevelt, who was the president, then wrote to her, complimented her on Youth Aliyah. Fiorello LaGuardia, who was the mayor of New York, gave her the keys to the city. And then, in Israel, I think she's still known because there are streets named for her. But she just got to be forgotten. I don't know. Does that happen to women mostly? Possibly. And it breaks my heart because the people of Hadassah know her. They do remember her. But nobody else does. And I'm happy to have brought it to life, as it were.
Now they will. Book 1, A Jewish Book from Childhood, The Bible.
I went to a very small Jewish day school called Shalom School for Girls. There were 8 girls in my class. And the teachers were these fantastic, not everyone, but many of them, fantastic women who in today's world would be heads of corporations or heads of universities or, something more than teachers in a little girls' school. But that was a long time ago. One of them was the mother of Gerson Cohen, who later became the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary. The other was the wife of Saul Lieberman, who was a great, great Talmudic scholar at the Jewish Theological Seminary. We didn't know anything about their sons or husbands. We just knew them. We knew Mrs. Lieberman one time. Dr. Lieberman, her husband, we called her Dr. Lieberman also. But her husband came. She had all the girls in the class over for a meal, a little celebration of something. And he came carrying the food. And he looked so disheveled. And we thought, poor Mrs. Lieberman. She's married to this schlumpy guy who knew that he was a great scholar because she was so scholarly in her own way. So learning with these women led to an enormous love of the text for me.
This was in Brooklyn?
In Brooklyn, yes, in Borough Park.
Okay.
They're not there. They still exist, but I think they're in someplace else in Brooklyn now. I got my best education. When I look back, I think my best education all around was at that school, but particularly my Jewish education. But it was combined for me. My parents were immigrants. My mother was born here, but her family had been born in Russia. It was really Poland. They called it Russia in those days. And my father was also an immigrant from there. He was the eldest in his family of 5 brothers. My father was very, very Jewishly knowledgeable. He had studied in Cheder as a child. When he came to America, he became a businessman all his life. But he never forgot what he learned in Cheder. He knew the Tanakh practically by heart, all of the Bible. He knew most of the Talmud by heart. He was just a very brilliant man. So when I went to Shalom school, I would come home at night. My father worked late till like 7 o'clock at night, but then he would sit down with me and we would do my homework together, as I later did with my daughter. But we went through all my Tanakh, my Bible Chumash assignments, and that was my favorite part of the homework and of being alone with my father and going through these texts, these Jewish texts, which gave me, I suppose it's all, you can psychoanalyze it. It's all an emotional connection of the text and my father and these great teachers that made me love those texts so much. And they really shaped me. They became my connection to Judaism. When I go to synagogue, probably almost every week, not always, but the part of it that I really care about is the reading of the Torah. It's the reason I go, basically. And I think our texts, they got a lot of crazy stuff in our texts, and they've got some bad stuff in them too. But they define us because they have some great values, and they define us as a people. This is our history. This is where we came from. This is what we believe in. These are the things we aspire to. These are the values we aspire to. Caring for the poor, caring for the widow and orphan, leaving parts of our fields, little pieces of the edges of our fields, part of the wheat are there for the poor to pick up. These are some of the values. And even the stories Every one of our heroes is flawed, and that's part of the wonder and the greatness of it, that they are heroes, but they are real people, and we can relate to them. And so I relate to the stories. I love the biblical stories, but I also love the teachings. And I think that of everything we have, of all our practices, of whatever we have, it goes back to text. What was it that Louis Finkelstein said? When I pray, I speak to God, but when I study, God speaks to me.
It was probably pretty unusual for girls to attend a fully Jewish day school.
Well,
right? You said it was
a girls' school.
Yeah.
But there was a very small school.
There weren't many of them, I imagine.
There weren't many of them, and none of my friends in later life, had that kind of education. And I am so grateful to my parents. I had an older brother. My beloved brother died some months ago. There was no question they would send him to the yeshiva for boys. But when it came my turn, my father, the same father who taught me so much, said, and there wasn't much money, he said, she's a girl. A girl doesn't need that kind of education. And my mother, to her credit, said, whatever he gets, whatever education he gets, she gets. And that was why I got that education. I am so eternally grateful for it. It would just shape my life. It shaped my thinking. And it's, to this day, gives me enormous pleasure.
Did your mother have that education?
No. My mother she didn't know any of it, but she loved to listen to my father. And when I got very old, and my father was 100 when he died, my mother was 94. When I got very old, he would repeat his stories, and my mother would say, well, my memory's no good. I don't remember him telling that. And she would listen to it again and again. She loved the text that, he spoke about, but she didn't know it. And my brother didn't take to it the way I did. My brother liked it. My brother became involved in Israel in later life. He became the head of the American Jewish Congress, but he didn't have the religious feelings that I had, and he liked the text, but he didn't feel wedded to them as I did.
I also wonder, probably at a girls' school, you spent much more time with the Tanakh, with the biblical stories, than in a boys' school. They probably moved
they
on
studied
to
Talmud much more.
Right.
We got a little Talmud, but we didn't get much. We got some Talmud.
Oh, you did?
I love that too. I love Talmud. But yes, I think that's a good observation on your part. They probably didn't spend that much time. And they had maybe one or two good teachers. It was a much bigger school than the girls' school. But they didn't have the kind of teachers I had. And some of those male teachers were bitter. They used to hit the boys. Nobody ever hit a girl in a girls' school. So it was a different atmosphere. And I don't think he came to love it the way I came to love it.
And then you went to List College, right?
No, it wasn't called List College in those days. I went to Brooklyn College in the daytime. Everybody in the world I knew went to Brooklyn College or City College. We all went to city colleges. There's no money. But then at that time, it was just called the Seminary College. There were two. You went to two different schools. You didn't go to one school that combined. Like List College combines the education between Columbia or Barnard and the seminary. There you just went to whatever college you went to in the daytime. And then we went to the seminary at night. I used to come. At that point, my parents had moved to Bell Harbor, which is in Queens. It's near Rockaway. Much bigger trip. So I used to come home maybe 10 o'clock at night, sitting on the subway with a big Talmud in front of me, figuring I'll do my homework now. So I'd sit with this big Talmud open, and we came to you had to take a bus when you got off from the subway to get to my home. And I would wait on a dark corner in Flatbush for this bus to come, carrying my books. Never occurred to anybody to worry about me, to think about danger. Never occurred to us. I'd come home late at night, sit on the bus, sit on the train with my Talmud open. Never thought of anybody doing any harm to me.
I love how much it sounds like that you absorbed of the text, like how much you still, even just hearing about your father having memorized so much of it, that's so rare now.
Yes.
To have absorbed it to that degree.
I can't say I memorized it the way he memorized it, but he knew it. When the last Seder that we had, he couldn't see, he was blind at that point, but he knew the whole Haggadah by heart, so it didn't matter. He was an extraordinary.
On Death, Sex, and Money, we feature interviews with you, our community of listeners, getting honest about uncomfortable things.
I developed an illness where it isn't safe for me to drive. A friend once said to me, sex is like air. You don't think about it until you're not getting enough. This is a similar sort of thing if you just replace sex with driving.
Listen to Death, Sex, and Money wherever you get podcasts.
Book 2, A Jewish Book from Adulthood, Marjorie Morningstar, by Herman Wouk.
Now, I'm really embarrassed to have chosen Marjorie Morningstar, but I have to be honest. Yeah, Marjorie Morningstar by Herman Wouk is not great literature, but it breezes along. You don't want to put it down. And it's a story of a young woman whose name was Morgenstern, changed it to Marjorie Morningstar because she wanted to be an actress. And then she met this man named Noel Ehrman, who was also Jewish but had rejected everything Jewish and was filled with sarcasm and, irony, and said that in the end, Jewish girls all become what he called Shirleys, that they conform, they get big engagement rings, and they get married, and they have children, and whatever tiny rebellion they might have shown earlier disappears. He was very superior, and she fell in love with him. Eventually, she had an affair with him, and she gave up, which in those days was a big deal, her virginity. But in the end, she realizes that he isn't really this great man. He never really gets to accomplish anything. And she marries a nice Jewish boy and indeed settles down and has children and lives in the suburbs. Herman Wouk, the author, was Orthodox. He was valuing Jewish tradition. On the other hand, he had one character look at her as a middle-aged woman and say she's nothing like this exciting woman she had been when she was young. So there was some ambivalence on his part. But for me, and not just me, it was all the girls in my generation, we felt for the bad boy, the man who had, rejected the Judaism and often didn't treat us very nicely, didn't really care. They were so sarcastic. I was madly in love with the son of a rabbi who had rejected everything Jewish. He himself wanted to be a musician. In the end, he became a doctor, which is what his parents wanted him to do. So, but he was so sarcastic and so superior and brilliant. There was this sense, that we can be the person who can bring this person back to the tradition, but we'll do it in a more sophisticated way than our parents had done it. And, it was just a pipe dream. It never worked out that way. And in the end, I think I came to value those Jewish traditions. It wasn't something to make fun of, oh, you're a Shirley. No, you're someone who really values that's something that's meaningful in the world. Herman was, I think, Herman Wouk's way of saying a Luftmensch, an airhead. It sounds great and it's sophisticated and exciting. But in the end, what really matters are the values that you hold and how you live your life. If you choose to accept Jewish tradition because it has meaning for you, that's not something to laugh at. As it turned out, I didn't live a traditional life in the suburbs. I married a man who was beginning a medical school, and I had to get a job and support him in medical school. So we lived in Chicago and the family lived in New York. We didn't have a child until much later. So it was not a traditional life. But the Jewish values remained with me. And I think that this book affirmed those values for me. I didn't have to live in the suburbs, but I could keep those values. And an interesting thing I came to realize in much older, later life, my friends are all writers. Most of them are Jewish, almost all of them are Jewish, but they're all writers. Well, none of them had the background I had, and none of them had the tradition and knew the tradition. But they, in a way, envy me. They come here. I used to have big Hanukkah parties, and they loved learning about Hanukkah. They loved to come here for Jewish holidays. They love to learn this, and this is something that they don't have and they will never have, and they regret it. And so things that were in Marjorie Morningstar, Noel Ehrman made fun of became the important stakes of my life, the important values of my life that actually are the values that other Jewish women who may have led the kind of lives that they weren't actresses, but they became writers at young age, that no women valued, they are missing something, or they have always felt that they're missing something. So I think in that sense, this book reaffirmed who I was. It wasn't that it shaped me, but it reaffirmed who I was. And it was a great read anyway.
It's interesting because there's that thread where she comes back to tradition at the end. And there's also the thread where, Herman Wouk was maybe saying that was a good thing for her. But he was also saying that, that big life that she thought she was going to lead was not for her. You did not take that part to heart.
No, it didn't mean anything to me. I never wanted to be an actress. And I had that other life. I mean, for me personally, I had that other life because I had a job. My friends didn't do that. My friends got married. And I got married young too, but they got married and settled down. And many of their husbands went in. It was something that they did make fun of, and she made fun of in the book. Many of their husbands went into their fathers or their father-in-law's businesses, most of their husbands. So in a way, I led the life that she wanted to lead. I didn't become an actress, but I became a writer. And through that route, my writer friends became writers in different ways. They didn't go through this Jewish route. But for me, it was because I had the background. And even there, my first job, my husband went to medical school in Chicago. So the job that I got was at World Book Encyclopedia, which is published in Chicago. And very soon, I was given a position as acting senior editor in charge of religion articles because the editor-in-chief said, well, you know one, you know them all. So I worked with priests and, others in other religions on the articles that they wrote because I knew I had such a strong grounding in my own religion. So it helped me very much in that way also.
That's so interesting. So I know you came to be the editor of the first Ms. Reader in 1973 and edited Free to Be You and Me in 1974.
Well, that came about because I was always taking jobs to make enough money to put him through medical school. When we moved back to New York, the job I had was with the publishers of Look magazine. But we had a book division, and I was in the book division. But I got to know an editor, Pat Carbine, at Look magazine. And then she became the editor of Ms. Magazine. And so when she became the editor of Ms. Magazine, she asked me to edit this anthology of early articles in Ms. Magazine, which I did. And then from there, they were doing Free to Be You and Me, and they asked me to edit that book.
Did they ask you, I guess what I'm asking is, how did the feminism streak sort of evolve for you?
For me? Well, it started evolving back when I was working to support my husband back in Chicago. So I became acting senior editor. And I was acting senior editor for a long time because they never had a woman who was senior editor. And so finally I got up my courage, which for me was not easy to do. And I went to one of the big shot men there, the managing editor, I think he was. And I said, I'm getting paid less than the other senior editors, and it's been a long time, and maybe I could, but in a very timid way, maybe I could become senior editor. And he said, well, we've talked about it, we being all men who ran the organization, we've talked about it, but you look so cute when you're angry that we thought we'd just keep you this way a little longer. So that was the beginning of my feminism. From that, and also when we lived in Chicago, Marshall Field was the biggest department store there, the way Bloomingdale's is in New York. And at that time, even though I was the person who earned the income, and my husband was a student, I could not get a credit card because they would only give a credit card under a husband's name. They would not give a woman the credit card. And the funny thing was, I told them I had very close friends at the encyclopedia, and I said, we have to boycott Marshall Fields because this is a terrible thing. And they used to sneak out when I wasn't looking and to go to Marshall Field because there was no place else to shop. So we went there. But so that, I would say, was the beginning of the feminism streak. But the real feminism began when the Jewish Theological Seminary started talking about the idea of ordaining women. I was not on the original group that demanded it. Paula Hyman was a terrific person. She's no longer alive. she was on that group, but I was not. I was really still working and just, working and worrying about money all the time. But once the seminary started discussing the idea of ordaining women, they asked me to be on the commission to decide. There were only, I think, 2 or 3 women on the commission, and they were not in favor of it. And I just knew in my gut that I was in favor of having women ordained as rabbis. And that was really the beginning of my activism in that area.
But in other words, it was only once you were appointed to the commission that it sort of became a bigger issue for you.
Yes, it became an activist
That's
thing.
so interesting. And how were you, in your Jewish life, in your day-to-day Jewish life, going to shul every Shabbat, what did that look like at the time?
Well, we belonged to a conservative movement, so the conservative movement, was more apt to have women read the Haftarahs, or read the Torah. It's a whole different story. I saw everything wrong in the Bible about women, but I finally I couldn't reject all the texts that I loved so much because of the attitude toward women. It was from a different time, and there are people who worked on that. Judith Hauptman wrote wonderful things about reading the text. And so I was angry about it, but I got over that anger. I came to accept that this was part of what it was, and you take what you want out of it. By the way, I edited Free to Be You and Me just about the same time. I think of the 70s, just about the same time the whole question of women rabbis came up. So it was a dual thing. It was the secular and the religious at the same time. Very recently, the rabbi of my synagogue said he was using the AI chat box of what would different people say about the 10 Commandments in the Bible. So he has the chat, what would Freud say, what would Einstein say, but what would Francine Klagsbrun say about it? That was a very good company. So the chat box, the AI came up with this very feminist attitude toward the 10 Commandments. It's all written in, masculine terms. So the AI said, given Francine Klagsbrun's attitude to the 10 Commandments is kind of negative. They're outdated because they're very anti-feminist. And so he asked me what I thought of it. And my answer was, that's totally wrong. That is not at all what I would think about the 10 Commandments. I think 10 Commandments were revolutionary. The Sabbath was introduced, which nobody else had that, even for slaves. The values that were given there. But you can't judge everything ancient by today's standards. You can change what you can change, but you can't change the basic text, so you can interpret them and you can understand where they're coming from.
Yeah. You touched very modestly on your life as an activist, but I wonder if you could just tell me, what are the things you're most proud of having been involved in that aspect?
Well, the women rabbis, I'd say I'm most proud of, because I really was a loudmouth with that. And I really pushed for that very hard on that commission. And I won't name names, but somebody who I loved, some professor at the seminary, left the movement because of women being ordained, started his own movement. We remained friends, but it was never the same. That broke my heart, but still I wouldn't change that. I mean, I think in every way possible, women should have exactly, at this point it just sounds stupid to even say it, because we know that women should have equal rights with men in every way possible. I guess there are some things that women can't do or men can't do that women do, but in every other way. And then I just think I gave so many talks about equality for women in Judaism, and equality for women outside of Judaism. And I guess if they made any impact, maybe they did, I'm proud of having stood up for women and still standing up.
Yeah, there are definitely plenty that my generation takes for granted because your generation made a big stink.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, my daughter is a physician, went to medical school. It didn't occur to me to go to medical school. I was supporting my husband in medical school. Not that I was good in science, not that I could have made it, but it never crossed my mind, that it was going to be my career that mattered. It was always about his career. And now it's taken for granted, as you say, that women enter any career that they want to. And that's a terrific result of feminism.
Book 3, A Book That Changed Your Worldview, The Plot Against America by Philip Roth.
Your question was a book that I thought everyone should read.
Yes, a book everyone should read.
Well, that was the large part of it, really, Good. For me. The book imagines a world in which Franklin Roosevelt lost the election back in 1942, I guess. And Charles Lindbergh, who was this great pilot hero, won. But Charles Lindbergh was also an isolationist, someone who felt that America first, make America great again. Those were slogans of those days. And he felt that that's what America should be. And he was anti-Semitic. And so what does in that book is he uses his own name, which he's done in other places too. The characters are Philip and his brother Sandy and his father Herman. And Lindbergh and Roosevelt uses real names, but it's a work of imagination. And what the world would be like. The Jews were being sent to special colonies out of cities like New York or Chicago to Kentucky or, out west, so they would be trained to think more like, quote, Americans, be more assimilated. And actually, Philip's brother, that happens to him. He gets sent to one of these farms and he comes back looking down on everything Jewish. There are more and more restrictions on the Jews. And Lindbergh, in real life, Lindbergh also admired Adolf Hitler. And in the book, the German practices, they're being introduced into the United States. First place, it's a terrific book. Philip Roth is a great writer. But I felt this book was very important. It was important to me when I read it because it opened my eyes back then. And it's important for everyone to read, to see what happens when a society allows itself to go to the extreme. And American society, and particularly in our time when AI, Thomas Friedman wrote a terrific editorial in the New York Times some weeks ago about how AI is going to keep developing and become perhaps dangerous for the next generation. And it's going to take world leaders working together, the United States working with leaders of the rest of the world to know how to control this, and we can't pull back. So I really feel that this is a very important time for everyone to read this book.
And you're about the same age as the narrator, Philip Roth, like a small child when that was all. Are there things that you remember about the politics of that time?
Of that time, Roosevelt did become, the book ends with Roosevelt becoming president again. Roosevelt did become president, but there were, up until then, there was a very strong movement, and they even used terms like "Make America Great Again" and "America First." That was what the movement was called. That was to keep the United States away from any foreign interference, not to be involved in any foreign wars. And there was a lot of anti-Semitism at that time. And they called Roosevelt, they said this was a Jewish war. They called Roosevelt, I think they called him Rosenfeld, a Jewish name, that he's being lured into this European war, World War II we're talking about, by the Jews. The anti-Semitism, when you look back, society today, we're struggling with anti-Semitism again today. But when you look back, it was pretty awful. We didn't realize, it was so much better for my parents than Europe had been. We sort of didn't think much about it, but my brother had a close friend who wanted to go to medical school. He was a brilliant guy. Couldn't get into any medical school. They had quotas on Jews. There were places Jews couldn't live in. They were restricted. And it was awful in that sense, but we lived that life. We didn't think that much about it. As a child, I guess it didn't affect me that much. My father and my parents were very upset about those things. But there was a large segment of society that felt, they were called isolationists, that America had to keep out of foreign wars and foreign affairs. We had to just do what was good for America. And it would have been a disaster had we not entered World War II. Hitler would have probably won that war, and it would have then come to the United States. I mean, we helped save the world and save ourselves by fighting in that war. But that was a very, very strong feeling at that time. And Roth was reflecting that feeling in his book.
Book 4, the book you're reading now, The Propagandist, by Cécile de Prairie.
Somehow, the war has never left me. I didn't live in Europe, but my husband came from Belgium as a child, and if you look at our library, it's filled with World War II books that he used to read. So I'm reading a book called The Propagandist by Cécile de Prairie. It's a novel, but it's based on her own life. She's a historian, and it's the story of, it's a true story, but she's fictionalized it. It's how her parents were complicit of the German invasion of France and their German takeover of France during World War II. And the propagandist was her mother, who used to make propaganda posters that lauded Hitler and the Germans. One poster made fun of people who were great heroes in the French resistance. And she was a child, and she would just sit and listen to this stuff and not, totally know what was going on, but she got to understand later. There were large numbers of people who really liked having the Germans take over and were anti-Semitic and thought it was great that the Jews would be sent away, get rid of them all. So the novel is based mostly on it's her story and the story of her mother, particularly her mother. She calls her Lucy in the novel, is very clever. I haven't finished the book yet, but she's very clever. When the Allies liberate Paris, she kind of manages to switch sides, but the narrator really condemns the mother.
It sounds like a fascinating book. Book 5, the author's latest book, Henrietta Szold, Hadassah and the Zionist Dream, by Francine Klagsbrun. So as you started to talk about in the beginning, her lifespan is pretty amazing. She's born in Baltimore in 1860 on the eve of the Civil War, and she dies in British Mandate Palestine in 1945, just before Israel became a state in 1947. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about Hadassah and her Zionism.
Okay.
She speaks about Zionism before Herzl speaks about Zionism. And her Zionism comes from a place of her knowledge and attachment to religion and Judaism. So if you could give us a little bit of context for that.
Well, her father had taught her that Judaism is a way of life. It's not just a creed. It's not just a religion. It's really a way of life. And from her point of view, a way of life means that Jews are a people. It's a whole gestalt, as it were. And therefore, as a people, there needed to be a homeland. And then there was only one homeland that they could possibly go to, and that was the land of Israel, which she said runs like a red thread through all of Jewish literature. From her point of view, she didn't think that everybody had to settle there. She didn't. When she started Hadassah, I mean, that was one of the sort of genius parts of it. The women of Hadassah didn't have to go live there personally. They could be great Zionists by helping, by supporting and raising money for and creating hospitals and healthcare for the people in the land of Israel. That was also a form of Zionism. She saw Zionism as Israel, or they didn't call it Israel then, it was the land of Israel, as a cultural center to the Jews throughout the diaspora. And they didn't have to live there. It was based on the teachings of Achad Ha'am, who was Asher Ginsburg, a great Jewish essayist. Well, from Achad Ha'am's point of view, the Jews in the diaspora weren't ready to live in the land of Israel. But from Henrietta's point of view, they could, but you didn't have to live there. It could be a center from which culture came and spread out. And therefore, if you were in Hadassah, you could read about people who were writing at the time. She encouraged Hadassah women to learn Hebrew. I don't know how many did do that. But you could be very devoted, and you could be a Zionist by not living in Israel itself. She did a terrific thing with Hadassah. the Hadassah women were just, for the most class, middle-class women who had led, traditional lives. And they had to learn to raise money, to sacrifice some things themselves, luxuries themselves, in order to donate money. They had to learn to speak in public to attract other women. They had to learn eventually how to speak to world leaders, because Hadassah dealt with leaders from all over the world. So for Hadassah women, this was talk about women's liberation. We'll talk about feminism. I always see Henrietta now, I see her as a pre-feminist, as it was. She didn't speak of herself as a feminist as such, but she certainly advocated and advanced women's rights and women's views of themselves as worthy and equal to men. She created with Hadassah a terrifically strong organization and terrific women who, in my opinion, these women would become role models. They were volunteers. They didn't get paid for their work. Their daughters and their granddaughters and their great-granddaughters, all doctors and lawyers and whatever, writers, get paid for their work, but they saw their grandparents, their great-grandparent mothers or their mothers speak out and take active roles and make change. And I think that was a terrific model for them. So I think we have to give the original Hadassah women today are still doing terrific things. A great deal of credit, more credit than I think they've been given. People speak of Hadassah ladies, as middle-class women. Middle class. They really do a heck of a lot. Under Henrietta's leadership, Hadassah hospitals had to accept patients and staff of all religions and creeds. So they were Muslims and Christians and Jewish, all equal, treated equal. And to this day, that's still true. Treated equally, and staff members of all religions. And that was part of Henrietta. She cared very much about the Arab population. She cared very much about their health and their equality, and really worked to see that the Jews cared about them as well.
Yeah, that was such an interesting part of her story in Israel, was her vision for what the Jews in Palestine, in Israel, could look like. Can you tell us a little bit more about her kind of political ideas, or what she envisioned as an ideal vision?
Well, yeah, she really believed in a binational state. Now, would she feel that way today? I don't think so, but it was different times. She felt that the Jews and Arabs could live together peacefully, that, this is a land that belonged to both of them. Jews as well. I mean, she faulted the Arabs for not recognizing that there was enough room for the Jews on the land as well. But she faulted the Jews for not recognizing the Arab aspirations. There wasn't great nationalism yet in her time on the Arab part, but there was some. And she felt that they could live in a state, share a state, where neither is the majority, and even if they have a majority, neither is the ruler, that they each have total equity in running the country. And she wasn't alone in this. Martin Buber, the great Jewish philosopher, was a great leader in that movement. And she felt that really to all of her life, to the end of her days. And she actually argued with Hadassah when they supported the idea of just a Jewish state. She felt this should be binational. As I say, that was different times. And there was nobody on the Arab side who agreed with her. After she died, there was one Arab leader who agreed with her, who felt, yes, the Arabs should join with Jews in a binational state. And he was assassinated by members of his own family who felt he had erred, he had misjudged. So it was, in her day, it was different times, and she felt this was possible. Would she feel it's possible today? I don't know. But I think today she might very well support the idea of two states living side by side. I think she would go for that, as many of us do.
I want to go back to her younger life. You talked a little bit about her thwarted romance with Louis Ginsburg, who was the leader of the Jewish Theological Seminary. Right. Why do you think that story has clung to her the way it has?
Well, part of it, I have to say, was her fault. Part of it was her fault because when Louis Ginsburg rejected her, So should we say the whole story first again? I mean, Louis Ginsburg was a great professor of Talmud at the seminary, and she was older than the other students. She was in her early 40s. They were all in their 20s or so. She was 13 years older than Louis Ginsburg. He was a professor of Talmud, brilliant professor, and she fell madly in love with him. And she knew she was older than he was, and she knew that nothing would come of this, so she really tried to keep it under wraps as long as she could. But then when his father died, he poured out his heart to her, and she felt that there was a change in his attitude, that he now saw her as a person that didn't matter how old she was, that he loved her as she loved him. She felt that she saw the love light in his eyes, quote. And when he came back from a vacation in Europe, and he said he wanted to speak to her, she thought he was going to propose marriage. And instead he said, "You will be happy to know that I am engaged." He had had a whirlwind courtship with a beautiful, much younger woman, and she had accepted his proposal of marriage, and he got engaged to Adele. And that was a terrible, terrible blow to Henrietta. But to answer your question, so she let everybody know. I mean, it's not that she kept her sorrow to herself. The whole world knew. I mean, everyone she knew, she told how Ginsburg had betrayed her, or how awful she felt. So it was no secret. So that remained part of seminary lore, as it were. And I think people, still see it that way. Also, part of those times this was sort of the poor old maid and the handsome young man. Well, that's changed. We don't think of her as a poor old maid anymore. We think of her as one terrific woman. And one of the things I speculate in my book is what would have happened if she'd married Louis Ginsburg. In those days, a woman's life pretty much revolved around her husband. Matilda Schechter, who was also a brilliant woman, she was married to Solomon Schechter, and her life revolved around Solomon Schechter, and they entertained the seminary faculty and other people. That's who Matilda was. So would Henrietta Szold have ended up being Louis Ginsburg's wife and a seminary wife, rather than start Hadassah and accomplish all the great things she did? It's a real question. I'm sorry she had this tragedy. We're all sorry she had this tragedy. We're glad that she was able to start Hadassah. So I think that because she spoke about it so much, it became known. It was known in the seminary, and it became gossip that clung to her. And also because she never married at an age when women did marry. So she was different. She was, this single woman, and there weren't that many of them of her caliber. I think that's probably why the story has clung to her, as well.
I don't remember the exact words that you use, but I know in the end you talk about a letter that she wrote to her friend Jessie Samter, and she was maybe bemoaning the fact that she never became a mother, and saying that the sort of details of mothering are what matter. And you point out that the details of everything else that she did were also the details that mattered. I thought that was such a poignant.
She sort of looked down. I mean, it was a strange combination because, as I said, she had a strong will and she wanted things done her way. And yet she looked down on her skills. She saw Jessie Samter was a poet and a writer. And so she admired Jessie's creativity, but didn't see her own fantastic organizational skills as also being tremendously important. And so in this letter, she talks about, it wasn't only about motherhood. She did regret that she didn't have children of her own, or so it's been said. But she spoke about the details of motherhood. Caring about details are really important for motherhood. But caring about details, as she does, really is just work. It doesn't really count for that much. And yet caring about details is what made her so fantastic, that she could organize everything so beautifully. And what was so incredible about her, in the early days, one of the first things they did, Hadassah did, was create this medical unit, they called it. It was a group of doctors and nurses and equipment that was being sent over to the land of Israel. And then when they had a director, and when the director went on vacation for a while, Henrietta went there to the land of Israel and took over this medical unit. Now, here was a woman who didn't even go to college, let alone medical school, and she did a fantastic job, and everybody was sorry when the director came back because she was so much better at it. Well, she was brilliant, and she had this incredible skill, but she didn't allow herself to recognize how really terrific her caring about details was. I do have very warm feelings toward Henrietta. We'll call her by her first name now. I see a little bit of myself in her, this sort of lack of confidence and yet wanting to get things done in your own way. And also in some ways my life, very small ways, my life paralleled hers because I had been on the publication committee of the Jewish Publication Society. She was the first editor called secretary. I was also the only woman on that publication committee at that time. And there's a picture of me in the history of the Publication Society. And there I am, this young woman, surrounded by men. I can't get over it. The world has changed so much. So I sort of relate to her in that. And I was a student at the Jewish Theological Seminary, as she was. My first job in the whole world was working at the seminary library. Gerson Cohen was the librarian. We became very close friends, Gerson, his wife, Naomi, and my husband and I. But at the time, typical, I really did everything. And I always thought of myself and wrote in my resume of myself as assistant to the librarian. And Gerson Cohen called me the girl at the circulation desk. So that was sort of explains what the times were like also, and why I can relate to Henrietta.
Wow, amazing. Well, thank you for sharing her with the rest of us. You wrote such a nuanced book that also felt like a propulsive plot. You were excited to find out what was going to happen next. I loved reading it. I think everyone really should read it, and she should be known. And I think it's really a beautiful thing that you were the one to sort of bring her back to life a little bit.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francine. This was wonderful.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for joining us today for the 5 books. Our guest today was Francine Klagsbrun, a personal hero of mine, and so it was a gift to have this opportunity to talk to her. Today she discussed her powerful biography, Henrietta Szold, Hadassah and the Zionist Dream. You can find a link to the book in our show notes. If you enjoyed our show, please be sure to subscribe and share with friends and family. I'm Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Our producer is Odelia Rubin. Music by Dove Rosenblatt and Blue Dot Sessions. Art by Dina Friedman. Special thanks to the Jewish Book Council, Adina Pupko, the Natan Fund, Miri Pomerantz-Dauber, and Naomi Firestone Teeter.